Good evening, everyone. This is a redo of a series which we did over the Yom Tov of Pesach on rabbinic assessments of Herzl's role in Jewish history. The series was sponsored generally by Dr. Salam Rina Langerman in honor of Rina's parents, and with the hope that Misha Anna L'Chananya Mishov Azariah B'Sech Kivshan Aishu Yanenu, recognizing the miracle of having their parents after the Holocaust, and Hashem should give them Arichos Yamim V'Shanim, long and healthy life. This specific talk was sponsored by the Katz children in honor and appreciation of their mother Pesci Katz and her heroic efforts for Pesach and for many, many other things. And I also acknowledge the Frankel family for making possible the recording of this series. On November 18th of 1898, there appeared a front page headline in a newspaper which was known as Chavatzelet. Chavatzelet was one of many newspapers which were published in Eretz Yisrael, in the Jewish world at large. There was a very busy industry of people having their platforms, their opinions for the Jewish world, which had many at the time, how things have changed. And each one had its platform. The Chavatzelet was published by Yisrael Dov Frumkin, and it was considered generally to be one of the newspapers that expressed the positions of the old Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael. And the front page headline of this paper is Kol V'Yodayim, the voice and the hands. It's the byline is the 4th of Kislev. The 4th of Kislev is 3 weeks before Hanukkah. What do we read from the Torah 3 weeks before Hanukkah? So on Hanukkah we always read Parshas Vayeshev, Miketz, go back, Vayishlach, Vayetze, Toldos. Parshas Toldos is the parsha of Kol V'Yodayim. Hakol Kol Yaakov, V'Yodayim Yidei Esav. The voice is the voice of Yaakov, the hands are the hands of Esav. And the front page, quote-unquote, editorial of this newspaper, it wasn't a shul bulletin, it didn't have a Dvar Torah on the front page all the time, but this particular edition did, express the following idea. It starts by quoting a medrash, V'yitein locho ha'elokim, right? Also found there in Parshas Toldos. It's the parsha of Yaakov and Esav. It's the parsha of the brachas. God should give you mital hashamayim u'mishmanei ha'aretz. And the medrash notes that when Yaakov was spoken to by his father, he said, V'yitein locho ha'elokim, God should give you. When Esav was spoken to a little bit later, when he came around to get his bracha, it says, Mishmanei ha'aretz yeh moshavecho mital hashamayim me'al. Offering, basically, it seems the same things, the fat of the lamb, the dew of the heavens. But it doesn't introduce it by saying, V'yitein l'cho ha'elokim, God should give you. And the medrash, which is quoted here, says, V'yitein l'cho ha'elokim bidin. Im ha'aroi l'cha yitein l'cha. If you deserve it, he will give it to you. And if not, he won't give it to you. But to Esav it doesn't say that. To Esav it says, from Mishmanei ha'aretz, from the fat of the land will be your dwelling place, whether you're righteous, whether not, whether you deserve it, whether not. That's the way it is. Why? Because Esav is mechusar amona. Aval Yaakov shu bal emuna v'tzadik amar v'yitin l'cha elokim b'din. Esav, who is not trusting of Hashem says he'll just take it. But to Yaakov, who is a person of Emunah, of faith, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, if you deserve it, you will have it. Rashi notes this also famously. That was when Shlomo HaMelech dedicated the Beis HaMikdash, and he spoke about the role the Beis HaMikdash would have. So there also, the illusion is that if the Jewish people come and they pray for something, and it is coming to them, then it will be given to them. But when the nations of the world would ask, it would be given to them no matter what. And Rashi compares it to what we have here, V'yitein l'cha ha'elokim. However, one way or the other, this medrash really just leads into the commentary, which is going to be shared here, about the kol of Yaakov, the voice of Yaakov versus the hands of Esav. And the writer prepares and sets up this idea that the koil is a spiritual effort, whereas the yadayim constitute the physical effort. And Yaakov Avinu's vehicle, it's not just his identifying mark in this mysterious story where who is this person, who is this phantom that appears in front of his father searching for the brachas, but rather it is a descriptive of Yaakov's greatest quality. Chazal tell us, Hakol Kol Yaakov is the power which was given over as an inheritance to Yaakov Avinu, the power of tefillah, the power of prayer. Where the hands of Esav, al charba chatichya, who live by the sword, he works with his hands. And the editorialist says that this is supposed to be the quality of the way Yaakov approaches things. He approaches it spiritually. If God sees fit that they should have it, then they will have it. Whereas Esav doesn't wait to see if God sees fit that they should have it. And Esav doesn't satisfy himself with simply using spiritual means. Esav uses his hands. And he goes on and he writes, and how foolish are those who their roots are in Yaakov, but they trade in the voice of Yaakov for the hands of Esav. Toim umatim es bnei Yaakov yolicham sholol v'yeshashu'um betikva shav umaduchim ki vashu be'emtsoyim asher bigvul bnei Esav mekaimam. How they fool and mislead their people, letting them believe that they will be successful if they adopt the ways of Esav, giving up the ways of Yaakov. Be'amram zirayenu ramah b'yadeinu tismochna osanu lakachas b'terem yitein lanu Elokim. Our hand is high, with our force we will take it before God is ready to give it to us. That's the Dvar Torah on the front page of the paper. Obviously, it is laced with meaning, with a message for what's going on around them. It's the front page editorial of the Yishuv Hayoshan's mouthpiece, and it's being published in November of 1898, which is the one time when Theodor Herzl was visiting Eretz Yisrael. It was when Theodor Herzl was visiting Eretz Yisrael, coinciding with the visit of the German Kaiser in Eretz Yisrael, coinciding specifically so that he would be able to lobby him as part of his strategy of getting the great powers to agree to grant Eretz Yisrael to the Jewish people as a homeland. And this expression was expression of displeasure. And if it's too veiled for you, well, we just have to turn within that same series of papers, and we find the following byline: Mar Cheshvan Tov Reish Nun Tes, from Vienna, Austria. Ach Elokim Yoshiat Zion. But God will save Zion. Lo biyad Herzl v'Nordau, not through the hands of Herzl or Nordau. Nordau was another significant leader of the Zionist movement, who Herzl brought into the Zionist movement as such, an important Jewish intellectual. V'lo ba'orach shel teva, and not in the manner of nature, kim al pi goyel Mashiach, but rather through the Redeemer, the Mashiach, v'gam im yismameach hakelo, and even if he delays, even should he tarry, wait for him. So if the message on the front page of the paper, which is expressed in broader philosophical terms, wasn't clear enough, well, inside the newspaper, they make it quite clear. And this idea, this philosophy of waiting for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to give it, that it should be in the hands of Hashem, that Jews use the Kol Yaakov, and we wait until God comes to save us. This was the philosophy which they were expressing, and this was the objection at the same time that they were expressing. Theodor Herzl, as is well known, was a Western European intellectual. He was a writer for the newspapers. He was something of a playwright. He was a thinker. He was prominent in significant ways, not in a Jewish sense, before he rose to the forefront of the Jewish world, but he was prominent in the world of the press, in the intellectual world. His role in the Neue Freie Presse, which was a significant Viennese Austrian paper, where he had the Paris desk. Herzl was in Paris, and he was very much involved that way. He was not strongly connected, it seems, in many ways to religious practice, certainly to religious practice. His connection to the Jewish people is something which is debated. Many speak of Herzl as if he was someone who was very distant from the Jewish people until such time as he was awoken by the Dreyfus trial, which was a demonstration of significant anti-Semitic expression which took place in Paris while he was there in 1895. And Herzl himself writes of that as a significant awakening for him, but there are many indications and books written, research done about the connections which he had to Jewish life before. But nevertheless, whatever connections he had to Jewish life, whatever Jewish pride he had that led him to make decisions to resign from his fraternity in the university because of anti-Semitism, to insist on using his Jewish name in the newspaper despite the fact that people suggested otherwise, there was definitely significant Jewish pride, but religious affiliation, observant affiliation, was minimal, was certainly minimal at that point in time. And nevertheless, he set about to do something, to dedicate his life to try to solve the issues that were facing the Jewish people, the issues of anti-Semitism. He undertook to do it in a way that nobody really had dared to do it before, a way which spoke of developing an independent Jewish national homeland in Eretz Yisrael, or possibly at some times entertaining either as a temporary or a longer term means to do it someplace else, but a plan for the Jewish people to come together to forge a nation. It was a big plan. It was an audacious plan. And it was something which made many, many people uncomfortable. Herzl certainly made his fellow Western European intellectual elite initially very, very uncomfortable, because in his telling of the story, the way he observed things, there was no way really for the Jewish people to succeed long term in their countries in which they were living. And people who had invested so significantly in being able to be part of those countries, to be able to make it successfully amongst the leaders, amongst the high society, whether it was in Austria or it was in France or it was in Germany, to have someone come and say, you know something, this is not our place. Ultimately, we're not going to be able to make it here. It always turns out that way. The host nation always ends up turning against the Jewish people. The Jewish people, try as they may, end up being put to the side, being isolated, being seen not as friend but as foe. It's not going to work as long as we're sitting at somebody else's table. We have to establish for ourselves our own place. That wasn't music to the ears of the assimilated or the attempting to assimilate Jews of many countries. It was more like fingernails on the chalkboard. It was very counter to what they were trying to do. It was telling the host countries, you know something, in a great sense, we don't belong here. Give us our own place because we don't belong here. And many people worried about that. And throughout the history of Zionism, not just in Herzl's day, but throughout the history of Zionism, the greatest opposition to the Balfour Declaration within the Jewish community was from those who said, we're not a nation. We're not a nation that should have our own place. We're a faith, and we belong as part of the other nations amongst whom we live. That was one kind of opposition which he had. It's not our subject in these discussions to talk about that kind of opposition. It's our subject in these discussions to explore how the traditional Jewish establishment viewed and views Herzl and his role. Because when you take a person who takes and adopts a whole new path of Jewish history, taking the Jewish people out of Golus, wanting to take the Jewish people out of Golus, out of exile, to take us to our own land. And that person, first of all, makes such a move. And second of all, that person is not the kind of person who you would have pictured through a traditional lens as being the one to do that kind of a thing. He was coming at it from this very, very secular background. How do we view him? Of course, to some degree, how do we view the movement? But how do we view the movement with Theodor Herzl and people like Theodor Herzl at the helm of such a movement? It was a question which obviously engaged people at all times during Herzl's lifetime and after his lifetime as things were developing, and until this very day. Until this very day, of course, it's a question which engages us. How are we to view such a person? Today, when we just celebrated 71 years of the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael, we see that the movement which he started has led to a restoration in Eretz Yisrael of the Jewish people, almost the majority of the Jewish people. 6 million, 7 million Jews in Eretz Yisrael in such a short time, 70 years after the founding of the state, 75 years, less than 75 years after the Holocaust. And we see the rebirth of Jewish life in Eretz Yisrael and the critical role which Eretz Yisrael plays in Jewish life, not just for the Jews in Eretz Yisrael, but as the source of identity and connection for Jews the world over. And you want to trace it back, he played a critical role in making this happen. So what's the assessment? How do we view it? How was he viewed then? How would he be viewed now? And over these discussions, I'm going to try to share with you perspectives from different people, different perspectives, very different perspectives from different Rabbonim about this. These are not going to be just the, sort of like perhaps the typical or expected, but presentations of people who had each one their own very specific and sometimes very, very surprising attitudes towards him and towards what he was producing. Today, what we're going to talk about are the attitudes of two people who came from the same neck of the woods, who in a certain sense were developed in the same Beis Medrash, in the same world. And that was the world of basically Romanian, Hungarian, Haredi, what was not yet then the term community, the strong students of the Minchas Alozar of Munkach. The two people who we are going to be discussing today did not live or were not offering their remarks or their interpretation of events contemporaneous to Herzl. The Eim Abanim Semecha, Rabbi Yisachar Shlomo Teichtal, the writings which we have, which we're going to be talking about mostly here, were writings which were produced in the 40s as the noose of the Nazis was tightening around the Jews of Slovakia, which was where he was from, and Hungary. He published his work, the Eim Habanim Smecha, in Budapest in 1943. The Satmar Rav, the Sfarim which we have from him about the subject come even later. They come even later. And his opinions were formulated even with the benefit of having seen not just Herzl as an idea, but the birth of the state and the miracles, what we would call the miracles of the Six-Day War, the Satmar Rav had a specific ideology, an ideology which continues on in his Hasidim and in his followers. And these two both came from the same place, and they ended up in different places. And the words which I'm going to share with you about them are not about Herzl the individual, but about the general approach which he initiated. The Minchas Elazar was the biggest Hasidic Rebbe in the area there of Munkach, which was again, that area of Romania, Romania, Hungary, that the Satmar Rav came from. And Satmar wasn't the biggest Hasidus. Munkach was the biggest Hasidus. The Munkacher Rebbe was the greater one. Munkach didn't have the succession of the same kind, and the Satmar Rav built up a tremendous following, a huge, incredibly huge following, which continues to grow and to develop until this day. But in a great sense, he was the philosophical, intellectual heir to the approach of the Minchas Elazar, Rav Chaim Elazar Shapira. And we're going to just cite here one source, an important source. There are many places where you can find the writings of the Minchas Elazar and his antipathy towards the Zionist movement. And one has to understand the framework of it, which is extremely serious and a major point of context for any discussion about Zionism. And that is that Zionism was appearing at a time when there were many alternatives that were being created and presented as to what Jewish life meant. The traditional Jewish community, the adherence to tradition in Klal Yisrael and Jewish people had completely changed as a result of the advent of reform and all that happened as a result of it over the 19th century. By the time Herzl came along and was leading his movement, there was so much defection, change, hemorrhaging in the traditional Jewish community. And people like the Minchas Elazar, appropriately and understandably, were Omed al HaMishmar. They were safeguarding the Jewish people, their communities, from turning to any alternative definition of Yiddishkeit that wasn't built around the Torah itself, around Torah strictly understood as the tradition of the Jewish people, as the constitution of Klal Yisrael, as the constitution of the Jewish people. In that context, secular Zionism did present another alternative. Secular Zionism was a movement which was populated and led by many people who either were themselves what we call Shana Upirish, people who themselves had been religious and observant earlier in their lives, learned earlier in their lives, and had cast it away, or people who were already, born of parents who had cast it away. But it was certainly a movement within Judaism, a focus within Judaism, that wasn't centered around the Torah itself. It was something which religious Zionists and the Mizrahi movements would struggle with, would consistently struggle with. Me'ez Hashem, when we have the chance to talk about Rav Kook and his approach to this whole thing, we'll see how much and how intense the struggle was in his formulation of it. But this was a backdrop to all of this. And it's not going to be at the forefront of this particular discussion, but necessarily it must be seen as the context in which a lot of this discussion takes place. The Minchas Elazar in Chelek Hey, in the 5th volume of his responsa number 12, has a responsum about Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, about the mitzvah of settlement of Eretz Yisrael. And he's discussing a tshuva from a different Hasidic master, the Sachet Shavar, the Avnei Nezer, where the Avnei Nezer wrote a famous and important landmark tshuva about the the mitzvah of settling in Eretz Yisrael, where he himself said many chidushim, many important ideas relevant to the settlement of Eretz Yisrael, which was happening in their time. Many Jews, a relatively small number, comparatively, but there were many numbers of Jews who had moved to Eretz Yisrael, who were settling in Eretz Yisrael, who were farming in Eretz Yisrael, and who were dependent to a great degree on the chalukah, on monies from Chutz La'aretz, in order to be able to survive in Eretz Yisrael. And the Avnei Nezer wrote a famous tshuva with many interesting ideas about how he saw the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. That tshuva, like all discussions virtually of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, begins with a discussion of the Ramban versus the Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvos. The Rambam wrote a book of mitzvahs, where he enumerated what he saw as the count, the proper count of the Taryag mitzvahs. The Gemara says that there are 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. Everybody knows, quote unquote, that there are 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. It's mentioned once in the Gemara at the end of Maseches Makos, that there were Taryag mitzvahs that were said to Moshe Rabbeinu at Sinai. And the question is figuring out what those mitzvahs are. The Gemara tells us that there are 248 positive commandments and 365 prohibitions, but go figure, what are they exactly? And remember, it's not even necessarily, and this is critical to note in this discussion, it's not necessarily a discussion of halacha. It's to some degree a discussion of nomenclature and systems. Right? Everybody agrees that to make a migdash, you have to have a building, you have to have an aron, you have to have a shulchan, a table, you have to have a menorah, you have to have a mizbeach. Everybody agrees. Is there any debate about that? There's no debate about that. But tell me something, are those all one mitzvah? Are those 3 mitzvahs? Are those 10 mitzvahs? How many mitzvahs is it? Are they subcategories of a single mitzvah of V'asuli migdash, make for me a migdash? Or are there many, many mitzvahs that go into building the Beis HaMikdash? They're not necessarily halachic discussions. What are the rules? How do you count mitzvahs? The Rambam started his book of mitzvahs by listing 14 rules as to how you count mitzvahs. And there's a lot of debate. The Ramban wrote notes to the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvahs, and the Ramban famously added a mitzvah. He argued, he took away some of the mitzvahs from the count that the Rambam did, and then he had to fill in the gaps. Okay, I took away these, what do I say take their place? And the Ramban famously added what the Rambam didn't enumerate, which was a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, a mitzvah to settle Eretz Yisrael. And the Ramban is very clear in his discussion of the mitzvah that it's a mitzvah which applied not only when the Jewish people were coming to Eretz Yisrael in the time of Yeshua, and not only once again at some time when the Mashiach comes, when we were supposed to retake Eretz Yisrael, but it's a mitzvah that applies at all times to individuals, if not to the entirety of the Jewish people. So the Ramban counted as a mitzvah. The Rambam didn't. And the question is, why didn't the Rambam count it as a mitzvah? And so much has been thought about, so much has been written about it. The Rambam many times in the Mishnah Torah writes very, very strongly and favorably about the mitzvah of, so to speak, of settling in Eretz Yisrael, which leads many to say, of course the Rambam says, just like the Ramban, that there's a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael that applies even Bizman Hazeh, even now. It's just that the Rambam, for whatever reason, doesn't put it on the list as a separate mitzvah. And they turn to this rule of the Rambam, or that rule of the Rambam, as to why the mitzvah wouldn't apply. The approach of the Minchas Elazar is that the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is not included in the Rambam's count because it's not a mitzvah that applies to the further generations. It's not a mitzvah that applies for the generations because it's not something that we do at this time. And in truth, it's something which is not even going to be gradually done in the ultimate time. The mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael ultimately will be accomplished by the coming of the Mashiach. And it's a multi-page tshuva. It's not my place to oversimplify. That said, you've all heard of Nisht of Shabbos Geret. I will, to some degree, oversimplify, and everybody knows what you do when you have a long tshuva. You turn to the last page of the tshuva. Okay, but it's a worthy tshuva to study from the beginning, throughout. However, his fundamental idea that he shares is that the method ultimately of being able to conquer and to claim Eretz Yisrael is not something which is going to be done through the hands of people, but rather it is something which we have to wait for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be able to do for us. Ayin b'yitzra achayim ala mitzvahs, b'mitzvahs asay l'reshes es Eretz Yisrael, v'zel l'shaynai. B'inyan yeshivas Eretz Yisrael, regarding the settlement of Eretz Yisrael, shelo yavei l'minyan shum mitzvah, ela ma sheyesh koyach b'yad enoshi l'kayim. It only gets enumerated as a mitzvah, something which is in the hands of people to fulfill. Aval mitzvah shetzarech ezer eloki u'nevuah, but a mitzvah which requires divine assistance and prophecy to be able to fulfill lo yavei l'minyan. It will not be enumerated amongst the mitzvahs. We don't find a mitzvah that a person has to be a prophet, that a person has to have divine inspiration. How could Hashem instruct us to do a mitzvah that we don't have in our hands to do? If this can't be done without divine help and divine signal, it can't be a mitzvah of instruction. Mitzvah kazais lo yavei leminyan be'ein ponim v'asar lanu lasei shum milchama v'kibush im lo al pi hanavi u'mitzvah tluya b'nevuah lo yavei leminyan. A mitzvah which requires a navi, and a navi is required because we can't wage wars, we can't do anything towards this end without a nevuah. It is not to be included. V'adarabah. And indeed, the opposite. Anu mishpoim shelo yimredu b'malchus el nekabel ba'ava ad bo yavei Mashiach tzidkeinu. Rather, he says, in fact, the opposite is the case. Not only do we not have a mitzvah to do it until the Navi comes and signals to us, but we're actually proscribed from doing it. And what he invokes is the shvuah, the oath which Hashem applied to us to not rebel against the nations of the world. Here, of course, the Minchas Elazar is invoking the well-known statement of Chazal, the passage in the Gemara at the end of Maseches Ksubos, where the Gemara says on Shir Hashirim that we learned on Pesach, where 3 times the pasuk says, "Hishpati eschem b'nais Yerushalayim," I have made you take an oath, daughters of Yerushalayim, and the Gemara says there are 3 oaths that HaKadosh Baruch Hu imposed upon the Jewish people, imposed upon the world, really one should say. One is that the Jewish people should not rebel against the nations of the world. The second is that we should not ascend to Eretz Yisrael, be ola le'Eretz Yisrael, bichoma or kichoma, up, to go and pierce the walls of Eretz Yisrael, or not to ascend wholesale like a wall to Eretz Yisrael. And the third was not to the Jewish people, but regarding the Jewish people, that the nations of the world should not impose the golus upon us too intently. And so that Gemara, says the Minchas Elazar, actually tells us not only that is it a mitzvah yet or isn't it a mitzvah yet? It says we can't do it. Hashem has made us undertake an oath. Usually when we speak about oaths, Mushba Vaymed Me'ar Sinai, the mitzvahs, we're already commanded, we undertook an oath from our Sinai to do the mitzvah. And here he says, the oath that we undertook at our Sinai was exactly the opposite, that we would wait to fulfill this mitzvah, that we would wait to fulfill the mandate of Kibush Haaretz. And therefore, we are supposed to just accept ba'ava, the subordination under the nations, until such time as Mashiach comes. This will not be natural. It will be through miracles that are unusual and amazing. Ad kan leshono, v'zeu matim im harbe midvarenu le'el. This matches with much of what we said before, and very much not like the Avnei Nezer. This is what this is what he writes. Now, you know, even the Megillas Esther, the early commentary on the Rambam, also speaks about this idea of the Shalosh Shvuos and how this mitzvah is unusual because we wouldn't be settling the land as a nation altogether going, but it would be a mitzvah, you know, one person at a time, which is an interesting variation on the mitzvah because of this. However, he, as a result, really puts aside the whole thing as being a mitzvah, and certainly in any part of a national movement. And then he continues, and he says, "V'gam yesh loymar," and furthermore we could say, "Ki b'yameinu elu shasu mehamischadshim lebekorim ha'elim u'mispartzim chok la'avoidosam b'chiyah gavna." He says, and especially today, because in our days, the people who are doing this, the people who are renewing this movement of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, these are people who are not doing it as one of the 613 mitzvahs. This is their own self-formulated path to the service of Hashem. They don't do other mitzvahs. It is their new way. They're mispartzim. They are creating all kinds of breaches. They are deciding how they're going to serve Hashem, and it's not through the ways of the mitzvahs the way we know them. He concludes and he says, in such a situation we would say that even the Ramban, who clearly says that there's a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael for all time, Udeime, and those who support him, Yoidu she'ein lishtadel b'mitzvah kazu, that one shouldn't try to do this mitzvah. And he brings a fascinating parallel. U'kumaysha amru Chazal b'matzeva. Chazal said about an altar which was made of a single stone, a matzeva in biblical terms. Yaakov made a matzeva, but we have a prohibition in the Torah, you should not make a matzeva that Hashem your God despises. We're not talking here about the matzeva in a cemetery, but we're talking like a matzeva in a cemetery, a single stone, but an altar, a mizbeach that was made out of a single stone. We're supposed to make a mizbeach avonim. So Chazal say, 1 second, what do you mean Hashem hates it? Yaakov Avinu made it. Hashem seemed to like it then. Say Chazal, he liked it then, but he doesn't like it anymore. You know why he doesn't like it anymore? Because what happened was that the Ovdei Avodah Zarah adopted it. And a practice which in and of itself might have been good and welcome and virtuous, but once it became co-opted by the Ovdei Avodah Zarah, it was not something that Hashem would be pleased with anymore. Suggests the Minchas Elazar, not suggests, says emphatically the Minchas Elazar that that's the situation with the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. The Rambam doesn't count it because it's a mitzvah which has to wait for nevuah, for the hand of Hashem, for open miracles, for it to be able to be fulfilled. The Ramban does count it. But even the Ramban, he says, would say that when those who were traveling to Eretz Yisrael were people like the Ramban, were people like the Amoroim that the Gemara describes would kiss the rocks of Akko because of the love of Eretz Yisrael, when they would come, when they would go. But when the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael becomes the approach of a new secular nationalism, so then it becomes distasteful to be involved in that. And even if it would be a mitzvah purely, but it's not a mitzvah to engage in now. That was the position of the Minchas Elazar. And he was very, very vocal and strong about this position. And you see that there are two elements to his expression of disdain. The first element is that this is not the way the Jewish people are supposed to go to Eretz Yisrael. It could be that the Chafetz Chaim would be leading the movement back to Eretz Yisrael, and he would have a hard time with it. Why? Because Mashiach is supposed to come with pomp and circumstance, with the miracles of Mashiach. It's supposed to be a nevuah, a prophecy, a revelation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not a process, not lobbying the League of Nations, not lobbying the great powers to give you a position in Eretz Yisrael. And we're not supposed to go, we're not allowed to go until such time as we are beckoned by an open nevuah, by an open prophecy that will miraculously turn things over. It's not a process, it's an event. And number two, this whole movement has been led and taken over by people who are not faithful to the Torah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore that in itself is a problem. Even if you would say that it's a mitzvah to go to Eretz Yisrael, but it's not a mitzvah to go to Eretz Yisrael following in the path of people who are leading you towards something that they're going to construct and build in a way that's not faithful to Das Yisrael. That was the position of the Minchas Elazar. It was a position when it was still in its incipient stages, and it grew and developed and continued. The Satmar Rav and the Eim Habanim Samecha both were, at least initially, followers of this approach. In fact, there's a sefer, a little sefer, a kuntras we would call it, more like a brochure, which was published under the auspices of the Munkacher Rebbe. And in that sefer, it was just presentation after presentation, article after article, some from the Minchas Elazar, some in the name of Minchas Elazar, but from many, many great rabbis and gedolim of that area and of that period, that was all just in opposition to Zionism. It's ironic that the title of the booklet was called Tikkun Olam, right? It had actually an English title, right? It was called Sefer Tikkun Olam. But the Tikkun Olam, L'Sakein Olam Malchus Shakai, that they wished was to try to set things right and to turn it away from this movement which was taking the Jewish people who knows where. And in that contrast, Tikkun Olam, which was published, if I'm not mistaken, in the earlier 30s, I don't remember right now exactly when it was published, Rav Yisachar Shlomo Teichtal, the Rav of Pistian, a resort town in Slovakia, penned and included a very, very strong anti-Zionist article. Of course, included in the anti was Agudas Yisrael, that bastion of Zionism. Agudas Yisrael's position was much, much more accommodating to involvement with the rebuilding of Eretz Yisrael. Agudas Yisrael had a major movement, as we will be discussing in Yirtzeh Hashem in the future, when we talk about Rabbi Dr. Isaac Breuer, who was the head of Agudas Yisrael, was very involved in the settlement of Eretz Yisrael and invested in the settlement of Eretz Yisrael. To the Munkacher and to others, this was not acceptable. It was not the approach or the path for them to take. And so, this was their position. And in the Satmar Rav's own work, the Satmar Rav wrote a sefer called Vayel Moshe. This is the main work of the Satmar Rav is Divrei Yael, which is a long, multi-volume work on the Chumash, and there are many other Sfarim published from him, from his works. But Vayel Moshe was his philosophy on Eretz Yisrael. Vayel Moshe is a play on his name, which was Rabbeinu, right? Yael Teitelbaum. His father was Moshe, if I'm not mistaken, and Vayel Moshe is also Vayel Moshe Lasheves Asaish. Moshe Rabbeinu agreed or swore to stay with his father-in-law. Right? He swore, as we've said before, swearing and father-in-law often can go in the same sentence, but in this case, he swore to stay with his father-in-law. And the play on words is because what the Sefer's main theme is discussing are the three shvuos, the three oaths, the three swearings that the Jewish people made to accept the Golus. To accept the Golus until such time as HaKadosh Baruch Hu would do it. And the Satmar Rav, who was a great Talmud Chacham and had very, very broad knowledge, develops the practicality and the applicability of these Shavuos. The Satmar Rav really goes further and develops the idea, brings the idea further here. Again, he articulates this idea of waiting until Mashiach comes. But what he has to deal with, what anybody has to deal with, is the problem of success. the problem of success, the problem of how this enterprise seems to have been blessed. Right? You and I might also believe that Geula should come to some degree at the hands of Hashem. We would say maybe people have to make efforts, so there could be a dispute there. But at a certain point, we stand back and we look and we say, but when people make efforts and those efforts are crowned with what seems to be supernatural success, then you say, okay, at this point, case closed. And where people really started to get the attention, if the fact that in a short time Herzl was indeed able to win over some support. He died before he got the full story. But if 20 years after he started, we had the Balfour Declaration, and he famously mused that in Basel in 1898 and 1897, the first Zionist Congress, he founded the Jewish state, and whether it would be in 5 years or at the latest in 50 years, and 50 years later, like a nevuah, right? People, it came, so people could deal with it. In 1948, they announced the state. Next day they have a war, a devastating war. They lost lots of land. They held on to lots of land, and they lost lots of land. And the fact that they did it could be the Hanukkah miracle all over again. The Maccabees that Herzl famously himself invoked in his own writings of the Jewish state, that a new generation of Maccabees will arise. But hey, when it really came around, it came around in 67. When what happened in 67, it was like, come on. Everybody sees that this is Nisim. This is Nisei Nisim, the most incredible miracles. And what happened? That was like, people died, people were korbanos, but the level of victory that occurred in 1967 was unbelievable, obviously miraculous. And at this point, if you're going to say, 1 second, Mashiach doesn't come through the blunt force of the hands of Esav that just uses their hands. They wait for Elohim. Well, Elohim just said okay, right? He said it's fine. He said, in fact, I'm helping you. I'm helping you all the way. So what happens? So the Satmar Rav wrote a sefer. And this sefer's title is even more clever than the first. And the sefer is called Kuntris al Hagula val Hatmura. Al Hagula val Hatmura is an expression from Megillas Rus, where it describes the kinyan of Chalipin, the famous handkerchief or the shoe of Megillas Rus, where you do something of formality in order to accomplish a transaction. And it's done for a geula, for redemption, for a tmura, for an exchange. The play on words, which he has a basis for, is there's the geula, there's the redemption, and there's the tmura. Then there is the exchange for the geula, or the poor replica of the geula, the Chinese Gucci geula, which is nothing like the real thing, even if sometimes it masquerades as such. And that's what the subject of the Sefer is, Al Hagula val Hatmura. And here the Satmar Rav adds another element, a very significant element to what becomes the philosophy, which leads to this sort of, like what we entitled this lecture was, Herzl, would we call him Shliach Hashem, or would we call it Masa Satan? Would we call this the act of, heaven forbid, the Satan? And what the Satmar Rav articulates is that philosophy, which has been repeated many times. And it goes like this. It goes like this. There are times when things which would appear to be miraculous are brought out, but they're brought not because they are the actual delivery which HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants in the full positive sense, but they're there actually as an act of the other side, as an act which is there to confuse and to test. We all know the famous Chazal, which describes how the Jewish people failed at the time of the Egel, and in fact ended up pursuing a false leader, a false redeemer, Moshe Rabbeinu was the person who led the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim. And Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who was going to continue to give us the Torah, to lead us, if we would merit it, into Eretz Yisrael, to lead us for a generation, certainly, there in the Midbar. Moshe Rabbeinu was gone for a little bit. He went up to Har Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights, and Hashem counted a little bit differently than the Jewish people did. And the Satan came, V'ir Beves Ha'olam, and mixed up the world. And what did he do? He showed them a sign. And the sign was the darkening of the world, a casket that would be purportedly the casket of Moshe Rabbeinu. And that Maisa Satan deceived the Jewish people. Hey, you know what else happened? Forget that. They went and they said, we have to create a new leader. And they took a clump of gold and they threw it into fire, and out came a golden calf, but not the kind of golden calf that you might see sitting on somebody's mantelpiece, or in their break front, or in front of a museum, or a government building someplace. No, a golden calf that was alive. Tavnis Shor Oichel Esav, the Egel came out. It walked, it ate, it moved. It was not just the image of an animal, it was animated. Wow. Look at that. Hashem has sent us a replacement for Moshe Rabbeinu. And one thing we know is Hashem didn't send them a replacement for Moshe Rabbeinu. Hashem somehow licensed room for a great confusion, for a false leader to arise that wasn't the real thing. And you don't have to look to a medrash. It's a pasuk in the Torah. Ki yakum b'kir b'cha navi, o cholem chalom, v'nasan eilecha os o mofes. A navi, a prophet, a dreamer comes to you. A dreamer comes to you. And he gives you a sign, a miracle, saying, here, you see? Let me show you this trick. Let me show you this miracle. It's clear that the hand of God is with me. But that hand of God is telling me to tell you to do something which was Ne'elcha v'navda Elohim acherim, to worship other gods. Says the Torah, that's a Navi Sheker. He's a false prophet. Pay no attention to him. But 1 second, what about the miracle? Ki menasa Hashem Elokim eschem. Hashem's testing you. Yes, he was empowered to create a miracle. Hashem let him create a miracle. But Hashem doesn't want you to be taken in by a miracle. Hashem wants you to always check and make sure that you're not following brilliant, amazing shows, but you're always doing what you're supposed to do, which is to listen to his commandments and to his instructions. Miracles don't demonstrate anything if what they're coming to support is something which is contrary to the Torah. And so the Satmar Rav saw all of the phenomenal success which he was able to witness in his own life as the greatest test which HaKadosh Baruch Hu had brought to our generation. And it must be a test, because Mashiach is not going to come this way on 2 counts. It's not going to come through the efforts of people. It's the revelation of Hashem. And it's not going to come through people and via a movement that is bringing so much abandonment of Torah in its wake. That was that philosophy. Rav Yisachar Shlomo Teichtal subscribed to this philosophy for most of his life. Towards the end of his life, as he was running and he was in hiding from the Nazis, he wrote his book by which he is most remembered, even though he wrote many Sforim before, and still in certain worlds he's known as the Mishnah Sachir, for his Tshuvos and for other Sforim which have been published under that name, under that title. But he wrote the Eim Habanim Semecha, which is a sefer about the return of the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael. And in this work of 4 parts, he formulates a counter-philosophy to that which he had felt and adopted and grown up with. A philosophy which explains that the redemption doesn't necessarily wait for the hand of a dramatic miracle to come from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but rather that it comes bit by the efforts of people. That what's necessary is for people to give expression to their yearning for Eretz Yisrael in order for the Geula to come and to be crowned with success. HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't give it to people who are waiting around, not thinking about Eretz Yisrael, not pining for Eretz Yisrael, but rather desiring and wanting to go and to build it and to make it happen. And so he has his own response and his own understanding of how it's supposed to work and an approach to the Shalosh Shavuos. But specifically, the Ema Banim Semecha addresses the issue and the question of someone like Herzl. Not just the efforts that are being made at the hands of people, but the efforts that would come from people who are not doing it as Jews of faith and religion in the conventional sense. Is that possible? How could that work? And I want to share with you a little bit of what he says. And what he says has two components. One component is a component which we would say is perhaps a little bit smaller or more incidental to the fundamental worldview of the Ema Banim Semecha. And that is that this is not unprecedented. Oh, he makes this point all over the place. There are many Geulas. Even the Geula of Bayesheni was licensed by the Persian king, was led and participated in by Jews who were intermarried and involved in all kinds of things. So maybe not led, others would respond, but participated in. But writes the Ema Banim Semecha, and this is in the second section of the Ema Banim Semecha. Have you ever heard of David HaMelech? Yes, you've heard of David HaMelech. Where did he come from? He came from a story of Lot and his daughters, a story of Yehuda and Tamar. And then he continued his kingdom by a story with Bathsheba. How's that? How do those stories look? It's so clear that there's a pattern that everything which gives birth to David HaMelech, the original and the ultimate Mashiach Hashem, it all comes from murky stuff. It all comes from cloudy stories. It's what is called in mystical terms, Nahora Migo Chashocha, a light that emerges from a very deep darkness. So what do you make of that? And explains the Ema Banim Semecha, something which is written in Sifrei Mekubalim, that in fact when HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to create something great, he puts it under cover. Because if he would come out and show and say, here, I'm going to now create the Ne'im Zemiros Yisrael, the sweet singer of the Jewish people, who's going to be their king and ultimately their redeemer, so then all that would want to undermine it would line up and try to put landmines along the way to stop it from happening. But if instead there's a drunk man who goes and gets together with his daughters, so those who are looking out for the planting of the seeds of Mashiach will say, I don't know much, but I know it ain't happening there. And when it happens with Yehuda going after someone who's dressed up as a Zayner, they say, I don't know much, but it ain't happening there either. And so they're left to be able to do their thing. Now to us, that's a very, very mystical concept. You wouldn't call that a keystone of a way you would live your life and your worldview. It is something of a rejoinder, though, to those who would say that how could anything good come from this? But I would still say that it's incidental to what was ultimately the philosophy of the Ema Banim Semecha. Perhaps it answers a kasha. It answers a question. How could it come? Why would Hashem choose that his Mashiach comes? So we have this interesting answer. But there's a far more fundamental idea and a far more fundamental answer, which is there. And that is one which the Ema Banim Semecha writes about excessively and finishes his book with. And that is that, yes, these people are very, very far away from regular tradition and Yahadus. But here they are, working in order to restore strength and pride to the Jewish people, to restore the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael. Is that a good thing? There's something good which is there. And he saw this as, while complicated, not simple. And he was already aware that it wasn't just necessarily benign ignorance, tinok shenishba kind of stuff, the way we would call it, but there was a lot of negative, anti-religious components to it. But there was still something that was driving the people, a desire to help the Jewish people, to strengthen the Jewish people, to rebuild the Jewish people. They may not yet have had it quite right as to what's supposed to be the constitution, the way of life of that Jewish people. But there was still a good starting point from it. And from that good starting point, greater things would come. And so, for instance, wrote the Ema Bonim Semecha. When Moshe Rabbeinu, when Yosef HaTzadik yet spoke about the redemption, he says, Pokoid yifkoid Elokim eschem, redeem he shall redeem, or remember he shall remember, Hashem will remember you. And so wrote the Ema Bonim Semecha that it happens in steps and in stages. That's why there's a double expression. If it happened in one fell swoop, it would be Pokod or Yifkod. The double expression is because it happens gradually. And how does it happen gradually? And he writes, the Navi Malachi, the last prophet of the Jewish people, wrote, Hineni shalech malachi upina haderech lefanai. I'm going to send my malach, my angel, my messenger, and he will clear the path before me. And then it says that he will come suddenly. That preparation, that clearing of the way is what's happening in our time. That they're preparing the land to be able to receive its sons, its children within it. There's pina haderech, there's a way of clearing the path before the sudden arrival of the ultimate Mashiach. And listen to what he writes in the name of the Menairas Hamor. Shekasa b'zeh haloshen ki kol hapoel shum davar afilu kefitivay nikra malach. Anybody who accomplishes something, even if they're doing it according to their nature, not because of free will, they're called a malach. Even the wind is called a malach. Isa malach of ruchais. A malach is a messenger. Therefore, those who are preparing and building the land, Hema Shluchei Hashem. They are the messengers of Hashem. They are the malachim. When it says, I'm sending my malach before you, Pina Derech Lefanai, he says, they're those malachim. They're those messengers. They're the Shliach Hashem. Not the Masa Satan, but the Shliach Hashem. There are many different ways, points of connection. This was something which would bring the redemption of the Jewish people. Everybody starts from one mitzvah, and a mitzvah is gereres, and a mitzvah will bring with it another mitzvah. He saw this as the hand of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Two views. The Satmarav, as we will see in the future, elements of what he said before 48, before 67, were very much the mainstream of Jewish thought. Very much the mainstream of Jewish thought. Many, many, many religious leaders of all stripes, not just extreme Satmar Munkach types, rejected the ideas that Herzl presented because of this, as we will see, God willing, in the future. But after the fact, few would say Masa Satan. And the Ema Bonim Semecha, in the middle, as was developing, he felt quite clearly this was the path which was being cleared. It would be building the way. See him as a Shliach Hashem. See them as the Malachim, as the messengers of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I want to close just with a lot. You guys want to stay here for another hour? Okay. I want to close with 3 quick notes. Okay, I'm sorry. 3 quick notes. Number one. In another page of this newspaper, it had the following delicious comment about Herzl. It said, Herzl is coming to Yerushalayim. Why is he coming to Yerushalayim? Because he discovered that there was an Avera that you can't do in Chutz La'aretz. B'leil HaShabbos Yud Gimel Cheshvan Bo Yerushalayim Dr. Herzl Hayadua V'Naisei Kalov. On Friday night, the 13th of Cheshvan, Herzl, the known Dr. Herzl, came with his assistants. His open purpose of his version was to inform his newspaper, the Neue Freie Presse, that he's one of the editors that which his eyes would see from the travels of the Kaiser, who was here in Eretz Yisrael. But really, we have also a hidden goal that he had to this mission, and that was to be over on an Isser Kores, a prohibition which brings with it death at the hands of the heaven, that you cannot transgress anywhere except Yerushalayim, and that is to enter the Migdash, to enter the Temple Mount. Nowadays, with impurity, in this manner, he was successful. In truth, he wasn't successful. In truth, he didn't try. He wanted to, perhaps, but as he wrote in his diary, my friends restrained me from entering the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He traveled with a man named Wolfson, who was a Shomer Mitzvahs, a Shomer Shabbos, who was a very close confidant of Herzl and his successor as the leader of the Zionist organization. It is also forbidden to set foot in the Mosque of Omar and the temple area, under pain of excommunication by the rabbis, as Sir Moses Montefiore discovered to his cost. When Moshe Montefiore came, he did go to the Rabbi's, and he got a very, very negative response from others. And so Herzl sort of stayed away. He didn't stay away, as he describes it in his own words, out of profound respect. He says, what superstition and fanaticism on every side. But you see the presentation. This man, he's coming here because he wants to destroy anything of Yahadus. Did he want to destroy anything of Yahadus? Everything of Yahadus? Was that his goal? Was that what he wanted? So one more anecdote. Herzl had a son named Hans. Hans was born in 1890. He, Rahman al-Islan, committed suicide as an adult. He committed suicide as a non-practicing Jew. He went through different religious things. He was a Christian. He was baptized. And by the way, it was true also of other people of that time who were Gedolim. You know, the Rabbi of Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, Chacham Bernays, his son was also baptized. It wasn't just because Herzl was an assimilated Jew. In fact, his son, Hans, in an interview, explained what kept him away from Yiddishkeit. He was traumatized at the age of 13. No, not by his bar mitzvah teacher, by his moil. He had a bris at 13 years old. Hans was bar mitzvah in 1903. His father didn't give him a bris when he was born. Because he was an assimilated Austrian. But by the time of 1903, his soul had stirred. As we will see in our future discussions, his soul had stirred to Yahadus. And as part of that, he had his son have a bris. It didn't work out so well in the end for that particular child. But was this the Mesis, Umeidiach, the person who was trying to take away the Jewish people from Judaism? The Eim Habanim Samecha ends his Sefer by saying that he's publishing it in the year B'cha Espo'er, which is Gematria Tafshin Daled. And it's, of course, the end of the pasuk which says, Yisrael asher b'cha espoer. Hashem says about the Jewish people, you are my servant, Israel asher b'cha espoer, in whom I will take pride. Said Eim Habanim Samecha. It doesn't say asher b'cha ani mispoer, I do take pride. It says I will take pride. Sometimes HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks at the Jewish people and says, you aren't quite there yet, but one day I'm going to have nachas from you. And said the Eim Habanim Samecha as he ended the Sefer, this movement is complicated. It's starting with lots of people, with lots of different motives and lots of different approaches, lots of different thoughts and ways of life. But one day, Yisrael Asher B'cha Es Bo'er, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will be proud. One mitzvah will lead to another, and great things will come from it. We will see this more in the trajectory of the life of Herzl itself, but we certainly see it in the growing faith and the growing Torah of Eretz Yisrael amongst all of its layers. Mitzvah Hashem, we will continue.